Hello, everyone. My name is John Lustria. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by none other than Hilda Koontz. And she's going to be talking to us today about women spies in the Civil War. Of course, women play an incredibly important role in the Civil War, from their activities as nurses, sending supplies to the front, being soldiers in some cases, and as we're going to go into great detail today, about their activity as spies during the war. A story that doesn't get told really all that often, and certainly not with as much detail as we're going to go into today. So I think it's going to be a great program. Before I turn it over to her, though, I just want to say again, thank you, everyone, for tuning in and watching our videos. We appreciate it. If you like our videos, you can support us. Everyone can do this. It's easy. It's free. Just subscribe to our YouTube channel or hit the like button. If you like the videos, hit the little like button on the videos. That helps us out immensely. Comment, let us know that you like the videos. All of that is free. Anyone can do it, and it all helps the museum quite a bit. If you want to take your support one level up, you can support the videos financially by becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. For as low as $25 a year, you can support the museum. That's only about $2 and change per month. If you think about it as supporting the videos, everyone pays $6, $7, $8 per month for Netflix, and so you're paying much less than that for weekly videos coming out from the museum. So however you want to think about it, if you become a member, it supports us and programming like this. So we'd be really grateful if you chose to support us in that way. But if you can't do that at this time, subscribing to our channel is one of the best ways you can support us for free. So thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the program today. With all that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Hilda.
Thank you, John. Well, as John said, we don't hear very much about a lot of these women's roles. And so we're going to go quite deeply into this topic, and I think you're going to find it absolutely fascinating. But to better appreciate the magnitude of the accomplishments of these kinds of women, it's really important to understand the constraints that women lived under in the mid-19th century. At that time, women really lacked full rights as citizens. They had limited access to adequate education, there were no skilled apprentices, and basically there were no job opportunities beyond the domestic realm. They couldn't vote, they couldn't serve on juries, and if they married, for the most part, women suffered legal oblivion. They had no rights whatsoever to control their own property, the direction of their lives, much less that of their children. Now, this is a picture of the very famous Southern aristocrat and diarist, Mary Chestnut. She was privileged, she was well educated, and even she said, quote, "There is no slave after all, like a wife." Now, the so-called cult of womanhood reigned supreme. It said that the only real woman was supposed to be pious, submissive, have a delicate mind that could not comprehend topics like politics, and was supposed to be only concerned with the home. Essentially, women were invisible. However, patriotism knows no gender. And so when war came in 1861, women went to extraordinary lengths to support their country, even though they really were second-class citizens. Women expanded their activities into humanitarian and medical work. Nearly 1,000 Northern women, and approximately a half of that number, actually hid their gender and fought next to the men in the military. As the war proceeded and more men entered service, by default, it was up to the women to run the farms, the plantations, businesses, to also take jobs in government and factories. So what else did they do? Well, they did the truly unexpected. Close to 400 of them joined what we call the shadow army of spies, couriers, and smugglers. Really, you say? Well, let's think about it. What better person to engage in covert activities than someone who's already invisible? I guess today we would call that protective coloration. Many of these women were recruited for this nefarious work, while others formed their own spy rings. They were far from delicate, let me assure you. They were confident, they were strong, they were well informed, they were determined, and they were loyal to their cause. Most of all, they were brave. Because then, as now, in military law, a spy is automatically considered to be a criminal and subject to immediate execution. When it came to spying in the Civil War, the Confederates were a little bit ahead of the game. Even before the hostilities began, their first recruiter, which was Virginia Governor John Letcher, sent Colonel Thomas Jordan to enroll the wealthy and influential widow Rose Greenhow as a spy. Mrs. Greenhow lived in Washington, D.C., and although she was an ardent secessionist, she was also on very friendly terms with the influential Republicans. If you needed a legislative favor, a promotion, whatever, she was the person to see. When her handler, Jordan, asked her, "What are you willing to do for the Confederacy?" she said, "Anything." And she meant it. Jordan gave her a 26-symbol cipher for coding messages, and she and her ring would have access to what was known as a series of safe houses along what became known as the secret line. This is kind of a somewhat fuzzy picture of this line, but I'm going to help you kind of understand it. Up here at the top, you're going to see Baltimore, and it skirted Washington, went down the peninsula, across the river in several places, and then all the way down to Richmond. Greenhow had an extensive network of acquaintances, and she assembled one of the largest spy networks during the war. She had 50 members in her ring, and they stretched from Boston all the way down to New Orleans. She had quite a cadre of these people. One of them was a clerk on the Senate Military Committee. Another one was a clerk for the Provost Marshal of D.C. and a clerk on the staff of the General-in-Chief of the Union Army, George B. McClellan. Another key to her success was that she was on very intimate terms with Republican Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, who happened to be chairman of the Senate Military Affairs Committee. The Confederates needed Greenhow to send them information about troop movements and strength, supplies, basically any communications between the government and the armies. In the run-up to the First Battle of Manassas, which was July 21st of 1861, Greenhow provided information to the Confederates on no less than 10 separate occasions. From diaries of the time, we have a first-hand account of how her first message made its way south, and it's sort of a prototype for how these transfers of information occurred. She wrote out the encrypted message. Then it was hidden in a little bag of cloth. It was hidden in the hair of a 16-year-old courier, Betty Duval. You remember that most women wore their hair up in little buns on the top of their head at the time. So Betty disguised herself in farm clothing, had a little wagon with a mule, drove it across the cart out of Washington and across the Chain Bridge. This is the Chain Bridge. Then she went to a safe house in Virginia. There, she changes clothes, hops on a horse, dashes off to Fairfax County Courthouse, whereupon she just loosened her hair, took out the message, and thereupon gave it to General Beauregard. She was never searched by the Union forces. And if you look here at the end of the bridge, you will see there are 2 guards there. They just smiled and waved her on by. Remember, she's unsuspected of anything. Greenhow's messages gave the Confederates a roadmap to success. This is what the information she could give them. First of all, the troops are going to leave D.C. for Richmond on July 16th. Next, there will be a force of 55,000 men. Their specific route will take them from Arlington to Alexandria, Manassas, Centreville. It mentions that the Union planned to cut the Manassas Gap Railroad line, and finally, Mrs. Greenhow even was able to get an actual copy of General McDowell's battle plan for the advance on Manassas. Well, as we know, the Union forces suffered a massive defeat at Manassas, and literally the Federal Army ran all the way back to D.C. It was a very successful endeavor for Mrs. Greenhow. She continued her spying activities, but soon she became under the watchful eye of Alan Pinkerton, who was then the head of Union intelligence under General McClellan. She was still passing on important information, but unfortunately, she got a little careless in her activities. When the Federals finally searched her home, they found ciphers and a lot of incriminating documents. At first, Mrs. Greenhow and some of her co-conspirators were put under guard in her home. It laughingly became known as Fort Greenhow. Despite the Federals' best efforts, however, including physically sealing up all the doors and windows, she continued smuggling out messages which would, in short order, wind up in the Richmond papers, much to the irritation of the Federals. So eventually, with all that activity going on, they decided they would incarcerate her at Old Capitol Prison. Later, she was repatriated to Richmond. She received a heroine's welcome there. After a trip to Europe in 1864, however, the ship sank and she perished. Looking back, both General Beauregard and President Jeff Davis credit her with giving the Confederacy much invaluable information. Even Union Major William Doster, Provost Marshal of D.C., referred to her as formidable and having masterly skill. And even abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts said, quote, "She was worth any 6 of Jeff Davis's regiments." Mrs. Greenhow's nemesis was Alan Pinkerton. He was a former Chicago police detective, and he had the very successful Pinkerton National Detective Agency in operation. By 1861, he and his best agents had relocated to D.C. to support the war effort. Now, Pinkerton was very appreciative of females working in the covert world. It turns out that he had hired the first female detective in this country, Kate Warren, in 1856. Pinkerton and his team uncovered and then disrupted a plan to assassinate President-elect Lincoln when he was en route to his inauguration. And Ms. Warren was part of that very heavily armed team. Of female spies, Pinkerton said this, quote, "At first, it was not deemed possible that any danger could result from the utterances of non-combatant females. That this policy was a mistaken one was soon fully proved." Just 6 days after Fort Sumter was fired on in April of '61, President Lincoln declared a blockade of all southern ports in order to starve the Confederacy of their needed supplies and to cripple the economy. Nowhere was this blockade more evident than at the mouth of the James River, where it passes between Newport News and Norfolk, Virginia. Both the Federals and the Confederates were ramping up their development of the machines of war, including underwater devices. In late summer of 1861, the federal government became aware of one such effort that was then being pursued in Richmond. Colonel Pinkerton was given the task of sending a spy to investigate the matter, so he immediately selected one of his best operatives, Mrs. Elizabeth H. Baker. At first, the Federals were aghast that he should choose a woman for the job, but she was eminently qualified for this work. First of all, she was a native of Richmond. She was very socially well connected. She knew everybody. And Pinkerton knew that women agents could go places, they could talk to people, they could ask questions of the sort that no male agent ever could get away with. So Mrs. Baker contacted some very highly placed friends she had in Richmond. It was a Captain and Mrs. Atwater, and no time at all, they provided her with a place to stay and a full social calendar. So off she went to Richmond in September of '61. The first thing she did was to observe and make extensive notes on the fortifications and the earthworks around Richmond. Next, she managed to witness a successful trial of the underwater boat that was of such interest to the Federals. The next thing she did was to arrange a visit to Tredegar Iron Works, where construction of several full-size submarines were underway. She learned that 2 of them would soon be ready for service, and they were targeted for use at the mouth of the James River. If Union ships could be destroyed there, then the blockade could be broken, and the development of these new subs would pave the way to opening blockaded ports throughout the Confederacy. So Mrs. Baker made copious notes, sketches, details of the craft as much as she could, and stuffed all the papers into her bonnet. Then she faked the need for quickly returning to the North. She obtained a pass from the very naive Captain Atwater, and she was back in D.C. in 2 days. My friends, you can just imagine how fast those papers passed from her to Colonel Pinkerton to the Secretary of the War, Gideon Welles, and then to General McClellan. Warnings were immediately telegraphed to the blockade commanders, and rudimentary submarine nets were installed. On October 11th, 1861, one of those so-called informal machines was moved into place on the James and launched an attack on the USS Minnesota. Note how the machine is propelled by 2 men, and also, if you look up here, you will see there's a little flotation device. They had some green camouflage on it. That's actually so that they could breathe in there. Fortunately, the submarine nets functioned as hoped, and neither the attack nor another one that they tried a couple of weeks later was successful. There is a report of this first attack on the Minnesota that appeared in the New York Herald newspaper the very next day after the first attempt. Obviously, Mrs. Baker was very good at her job, and that information was invaluable to the North. It saved lives, and it kept the blockade firmly in place. Now, we're going to take a look here at this area we've been discussing. Okay, to get you oriented, this is the Chesapeake Bay. This is the body of water that's referred to as Hampton Roads, which leads into the James River. This is the city of Newport News, Virginia. And down here, we have the city of Norfolk and Portsmouth across the inlet. This was an area of huge strategic importance to both the North and the South. Now, everyone, no doubt, out here has heard of the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, which occurred March 9th of 1862. That was the first battle between ironclad ships. More properly, we might call it the Monitor and the Virginia, because in late 61, or 62, the Confederates were busy transforming the remains of what had been the Union Merrimack into the ironclad Virginia. This is a drawing of the Virginia. At the time this was going on, a freed slave by the name of Harriet Tubman was then working as a housekeeper for an engineer in Norfolk who was leading the project of this transformation. To be perfectly honest with you, my friends, at that time, people of color were even more invisible than women. So she could easily listen into his conversations, observe all the work. They didn't think she would understand a word of it, nor were they worried about it one bit. And that was true, by the way, for many other people of color in the South. They did enormously important spying work. They were just considered not intelligent enough to be a threat. Oh, how wrong they were. Mary Tuvestri realized the significance of this project very, very quickly. She actually stole a copy of the plans and tediously worked her way north. She got all the way to D.C. in person. She delivered those plans to the U.S. Department of the Navy. She went back to her job in Norfolk. And later on, she sent a follow-up letter Secretary Wells advising him that now the Virginia is out of dry dock and it appears that they're going to arm it. Based on this critically important information, the Federal Navy sped up the completion of their ironclad, which was known as the Monitor. This is a drawing we have of the Monitor. By the way, oftentimes the Confederates described this thing as a tin can on a shingle. The Battle of Hampton Roads began March 8, 1862, with the Confederate Virginia destroying the USS Congress, the Cumberland, and damaging the Minnesota. The Federal Monitor arrived at Fort Monroe that very night and the next day engaged the Monitor and the former Merrimack in battle. The battle went on for 4 hours. It ended in a draw. But despite the damage that had been done by the Virginia, had the U.S. Navy not received Harriet Tubman's critical information, the Union losses would have been far worse, and supplies to the Confederacy would have flowed easily through the demolished Union blockade. Now, at this point in time, we really have to take a moment and discuss mid-19th century women's fashion. I suspect there are some female reenactors out there. I have been one for many years, and we can all attest to the fact that this clothing is not only impractical, it's cumbersome. But when you take a look at this, you look at it from a different eye when you realize you could smuggle almost anything in that clothing. And that is literally what hundreds of women did during the Civil War. One of the more notable ladies who did this was from the South. Her name was Belle Edmondson. She was very, very good in the smuggling world. Originally from Mississippi, she was living in Memphis during the war. At the beginning of the war, she served the Confederacy by being a nurse, but she decided that that was a little too tame, and so she moved on to serious smuggling. Pharmaceutical supplies, money, letters, you name it. She kept a very nice diary for us, and in a March 1864 entry, she described the process. Now, the picture we're looking at actually was in Leslie's 1862 edition, but you still can get the idea of what was going on. This is what Bell said, quote, "At 1 o'clock, Mrs. Fackler, Mrs. Kirk, and I began to fix my articles for smuggling. We made a balmoral, that's a petticoat, out of the gray cloth for uniforms. We pinned the hats to the inside of my hoops, tied the boots with a strong list, letting them fall directly in front, the cloth having monopolized the back, and the hats were on the side. All the buttons, brass buttons, money, etc., I put into my bosom." End of quote. On one occasion, the load she was carrying was actually so heavy that she had to hire a carriage to take her through federal lines. Understand, folks, she's going through federal lines with all of this cumbersome contraband underneath of her clothing. Once in a while, she would lose part of her load, partly, or other times she would lose the whole load. And finally, the Federals had just had enough of her, and they ordered her arrest. She escaped to Mississippi, remained there for the rest of the war. Of her activities, Confederate Major Thomas H. Price said, quote, "God speed you on your angelic mission of imparting comfort and happiness to the soldiers of the South, with whom the name of Belle Edmondson will ever be a household name." Now, this is a period picture of Harper's Ferry, now West Virginia. Between those high mountains and the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers, this entire area was a hotbed of smuggling. If smugglers were coming from the south to the north, they were smuggling information. They had maps, they had troop movement information, that sort of thing. But if they're smuggling from the north to the south, contraband could be anything because goods were so scarce in the South. Often the women would open up the seams of their clothing. They would sew little bags into them and with all the contraband and then sew them up again. What did they carry? Medicine, steel needles, pins, currency. They also smuggled armaments. For those of you who are familiar with period muskets, you know that you cannot fire one without a percussion cap. Well, you could put quite a few little percussion caps in bags underneath of that clothing. They would smuggle gun parts, entire pistols, and there were quite a few of them who actually were smuggling in bags of black powder. For anybody who's ever shot live action, you know black powder is very dangerous. At the beginning of the war, few, if any, women were ever searched for contraband goods. But as the war went on, the authorities had to resort to the practice in order to slow down the smuggling. In a letter home, one Union officer apologized for this breach of Victorian etiquette by saying this, quote, "We weren't looking for legs, we were looking for arms." That these women spies and smugglers were an ongoing thorn in the side of the Federals is easily learned from the military records of the time. They were described as follows, quote, "Secessionists, unsafe people, improper persons, formidable characters, bold, determined, unscrupulous, troublesome, she-rebels, etc." Wow. Apparently those invisible women were not as weak as originally supposed. Now this takes us to another formidable lady. This is Harriet Tubman. And most everybody remembers that she was a conductor along the Underground Railroad. That doesn't begin to tell her story. After escaping slavery in Maryland in 1849, she fled to Philadelphia. From 1850 to 1861, she made 13 trips into Maryland and rescued 70 people. She was a master of disguise and subterfuge, never detected and never lost any of her charges. This was a very tough lady, and she made it known that she would shoot anybody dead who wanted to turn back, because if the person would do that, then they would betray them all, and she was not about to let that happen. One of her abolitionist friends was John Andrew, governor of Massachusetts. In the fall of 1861, he asked her to take on the most important job of her life. Now, this is a map of the area along the South Carolina, Georgia, Florida border known as the Sea Islands. And I'm going to get you acquainted with this. This is where Harriet is going to be going, but you really need to understand what's going to happen next. Okay, up here we have South Carolina. This is the city of Charleston. Notice all these intricate little islands along the way here. Understand that the Federals don't really know too much about how they're set up, and they're kind of lost down there. You get down here, we're into Georgia. This is Savannah. And finally, all the way down here is the border between Georgia and Florida. Okay. Now, the Federal forces were occupying this region of the country, the Sea Islands. Thousands of former slaves had been left behind on those islands when the plantation owners fled, and they formed the New England Freedmen's Aid Society to send teachers and all kinds of aid workers down to South Carolina to help the former slaves adjust to their new lives. The cover story was that Miss Tubman was going to South Carolina to help with that effort. But her real job was to become a scout and a spy for the Federal forces. She was assigned to the command of Major General David Hunter's Department of the South, headquartered on Hilton Head Island, which is just about in that region. He provided her with a memorable pass. I've never read anything like it. Quote, "Give her free passage at all times and on all government transports. Harriet is a valuable woman. She has permission as a servant of the government to purchase provisions from the commissary as she may need." In other words, she had carte blanche, and she was hired because of her unique attributes. Not only was she a master of covert operations, but due to her race and her connections, she could travel and access human resources in the South that were crucial to Union success. By the way, all of her activities were official U.S. Army operations, so if you wish, you can fully document all of her accomplishments. Her first project was to assemble a cadre of 9 slaves and former slaves, many of whom were riverboat pilots. With their knowledge, they're going to do an accurate survey of these sea islands, and then the maps were developed for those intricate coastal waterways. Miss Tubman and her team mapped out key geographic points, locations of Confederate lookouts. The first time they put this information to serious use was in January of '63. They took a cadre of 800 men out of Beaufort, South Carolina, which is in this region. This is where they were training, all the way down the coast and then up the St. Mary's River, which flows between Georgia and Florida. They brought back thousands of tons of building supplies and other munitions, etc., to support the free slaves. It helped the Union effort tremendously. They suffered no casualties. The unit that executed this mission was the 1st South Carolina Colored Volunteers. This is a very rare image of them. This is them at their camp in Beaufort. When the Federal Army later included colored troops, they were renamed the 33rd USCT. Meanwhile, there was a Colonel James Montgomery who had been assigned to the South Carolina area. With Tubman's help, he organized the 2nd South Carolina Colored Volunteers. Between the two of them, they were a formidable alliance. He trained the regular troops, and basically Miss Tubman was operating covert operations, much like what we call special forces now, learning about fortifications, troop movements, and the like. Now we're going to go back to that map again. Miss Tubman's most successful venture ever was June 2nd, 1863. This is going to be a raid up the Combahee River. And the Combahee is here. Rather circuitous, as you may see. This was the first ever American military action, totally designed and then led by a woman. As described by General Hunter, the mission was this, quote, destroy railroads and bridges, take up the torpedoes, those are the mines, placed by the rebels on the river, and cut off supplies from the rebel troops. This is an ambitious project. Previous to the raid, Miss Tubman had located the slaves who actually placed the mines, got the locations, and promised people their freedom after the raid. In the dark of night, 3 gunboats, 300 troops, and Tubman's team set off up that river. One ship unfortunately ran aground, but the other 2 proceeded, missed all the mines that Tubman had mapped. The damage was unprecedented. The bridge was set on fire. The country's largest rice plantations were destroyed and flooded. Mills and storehouses were decimated, and the river was now open permanently to Union forces. When the mission was complete and the boat whistles sounded, the slaves rushed to the riverbanks to be rescued. And if you look down in this area, you will see the slave houses, and you see the slaves running out into the water to be rescued. They were all put safely aboard those 2 gunboats, and they sailed triumphantly down the river. And it was a triumph, because that was her greatest success ever. Those ships not only having done their military deed, but they had rescued 800 people and were taking them to freedom. It was a military and a humanitarian triumph. The Northern press went wild. As the Boston Commonwealth paper said, quote, the gallant band of black soldiers under the guidance of a black woman dashed into the enemy's country, struck a goal and effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton and lordly dwellings, and striking terror into the heart of rebeldom without losing a man or receiving a scratch. It was a glorious consummation. Miss Tubman continued her intelligence work for another year before she returned to Auburn, New York. Her list of post-war honors is innumerable. And when she died in 1913, she was given a military funeral with full honors. Now, the last person we're going to talk about today is this lady, Elizabeth Van Leeuw. In life, she was a tiny little lady, but in American history, she is a giant. And before we start this, I'm going to say this. Once in a while, you might see her being referred to as Crazy Bet. Please discount that. That was a myth that was promulgated after the war to denigrate her accomplishments. As we would say, it went viral, but it is totally incorrect. Elizabeth Van Leeuw was born in Richmond in 1918 to a very wealthy couple from the North. They provided her with a first-class education in Philadelphia. She was committed to the abolishment of slavery and devoted to the Union. Between 1850 and 1860, we know that she freed 19 of the 21 Van Leeuw slaves. Some of them were sent north for education and permanent relocation, but most of them wanted to stay in the South and work as a freedman. But Virginia had this law that said any freed slave had to leave the state within a year and to never return. So, to get around this, Miss Van Leeuw would free the slave. He or she would leave Virginia for a while and then would come back in to work for hire. If the authorities found out about it, then Miss Van Leeuw would just vouch for them and the cycle would continue. For all the world, it looked like she was conforming to societal rules. Instead, she was engaging in subversion, and it was going to be perfect training for the covert world that she would inhabit when war finally came. During the first few months of the Civil War, Miss Van Leeuw set out to improve the lives of the many Union prisoners who were being incarcerated in Richmond. Many of them were housed here. This is Libby Prison, and it was actually located just a few blocks from her home. Now, the authorities would never allow her to enter the prison or to talk to the prisoners, but with the proper amount of bribery, they finally allowed her to send in books, food, and clothing. In turn, by underlining words in the books, the prisoners began to communicate with her, passing on personal and military information. Because they were extending charity to the prisoners, Miss Van Leeuw and her mother were absolutely vilified in the newspapers. So, to project the veneer of Southern loyalty, they invited a steady stream of Confederate officers to share tea and entertainment in their home. Otherwise, they could have easily been sent here. This is the notorious Castle Thunder prison. They would have lost all their property for sure, and most likely their lives. When the Virginia Peninsular Campaign began in March of 1862, pressure on the Unionists in Virginia was almost unbearable. It was time to band together. So, Miss Van Leeuw put together a very large and diverse ring of spies and couriers that cut across social, economic, and racial lines. The ring included a clerk who worked in the Libby prison, freedmen, current slaves, local merchants, a restaurateur, farm families, the manager of a railroad who had his own ring of spies, and several prominent politicians. Until late '63, she and her team worked alone and focused mainly on improving the living conditions of Union prisoners and helping them to escape. She personally funded 5 safe houses in the Richmond area, which were set up to pass on humans and intelligence with amazing speed. Sympathetic authorities in the prisons helped the soldiers escape, and Miss Van Leeuw had 2 servants stationed outside the prison just to make sure they got to the safe houses. One of those safe houses was the Van Leeuw mansion itself. Quite often, while Confederate officers were being entertained in the parlor, there were Union officers stashed in the attic. This is the entry to that little attic hideaway. When it was in use, they put that paneling up with a big shifer rope in front of it. Let's make no mistake. This is very dangerous business. Let me show you this drawing. This was in the March 12th edition, 1864 of Harper's Weekly. This is a group of slaves who are helping Union soldiers escape. The way you really look at this picture is to see how dark it is. And look at the body posture. Look at the fear on everybody's faces. There are new people coming in at the doorway. Are they safe? Are we safe? Because remember, you could be shot unceremoniously for doing this kind of activity. If you want a modern parallel to what they were doing, then think about what was done in France by the French resistance during World War II. It's the same thing, and it can be just as deadly. In late December of '63, Miss Van Loo's mission is going to change dramatically. General Benjamin Butler, then in charge of the Union Department of Virginia and North Carolina, asked her to head the entire Union spy network in the area. She is now a spy master. This is a copy of the cipher that she used for all her communications. Under Butler, and later under General Grant, the focus of the ring was shifting now to strategic military intelligence, discovering troop movements, supply issues, logistics, civilian morale, food scarcity. As a spy master, Van Loo would receive requests from the military for specific information they needed. She would pass those requests on to her ring, and then, as the responses came back in, she would sift through all of this and combine them into intelligence reports that went out 3 times a week. Now understand, she's doing this all the time. She is more or less under constant surveillance by the Southern authorities. They knew she was doing something. They weren't quite sure what it was. The importance of her role cannot be underestimated. Her handler was George Sharp, head of Grant's Secret Service, and he said, quote, "For a long, long time, she represented all that was left of the power of the U.S. government in the city of Richmond." Her adventures are legion. But let's look at the summer and fall of '64 to see how the activities of the Van Loo ring affected specific military actions. Now, this is a period map of this area, just to get you oriented. This is Baltimore. Here is Washington. Here is Harper's Ferry and the Valley, which has been in dispute for 3 years. And of course, down here is Richmond. At that time, what Grant is trying to do is subdue Richmond and the Valley at the same time. And this thing is going to become a shell game with all eyes on Confederate General Early's Army of the Valley, Kershaw's division, which is generally speaking in the Valley area, and of course Grant's forces, which are mainly in Richmond. Van Loo's people were keeping an eye on the back and forth movements of Kershaw's divisions. They were crack troops. They're watching Lee's army. They're watching Early's army. They're looking at the condition of the troops. They're looking at changes in defenses of Richmond. The tiniest rumor can have value. Mid-August '64, Van Loo learns that reinforcements have been shifted to Early in the Valley. They're moving in that westerly direction. Grant takes that opportunity. He pounces and defeats the remaining Confederates at the Second Battle of Deep Bottom in Richmond, August 13th to 20th. Next, at the very end of August, Van Loo informs the Federals that Early's army is no longer getting any supplies from the Confederacy. They're running out. That army must either subsist or starve. Grant knows this is the kind of weakness that provides him with opportunity. September 7th, an agent reports that the Confederates are very, very busy sending all kinds of conflicting reports of troop activity out. They're trying to hide something. Finally, in mid-September, intel from the Valley confirms that Kershaw's division is moving east towards Richmond. And Van Loo reports that Confederate generals are in a turmoil about their shrinking options. This is the moment they've been waiting for. Sheridan moves and successfully attacks Winchester, September 19th, Fisher's Hill, September 21st to 22nd. As a result, Lee sends Kershaw's back west even before they had reached Richmond, and that opened the way for Grant to successfully attack both Fort Harrison and New Market Heights near Richmond on September 29th. On October 19th, the Union prevails at the Battle of Cedar Creek, and after 3 years of struggle, the valley is now firmly in federal hands. These brilliant military strategies could not have succeeded without the intel of Elizabeth Van Lew, who General Grant referred to as, quote, his guiding spirit. After the Union victories of Atlanta and Mobile Bay, the success at Cedar Creek gave Northern voters another reason to re-elect President Lincoln just 3 weeks later on November 8th. When Richmond fell to the Union forces April 3rd, 1865, one of General Grant's first orders was to provide 24/7 protection for Miss Van Lew. For this leader of the Richmond Unionists, he ordered, quote, all Miss Van Lew's wants to be supplied. When he became president in 1869, he appointed her postmistress of Richmond. But sadly, her post-war life was really a misery. Most of her Unionist friends had moved to the North. The South despised her, and she was impoverished because she had spent her entire fortune on the war effort. Her finances and her health deteriorated so much that a group of Massachusetts soldiers she had helped during the war supported her financially from 1883 until her death in 1900. They also funded her grave marker in Shockoe Cemetery. As you see from that inscription, her absorbing desire was that slavery should be abolished, and she certainly did everything in her power to make that happen. Well, my friends, we have just put a toe in the water as it comes to what intrepid women did during the Civil War, especially as spies and couriers and smugglers. I really encourage you to read more about it, and we are going to have a book list for you on our website so that you can get absorbed even more in what these fabulous ladies accomplished. But as we look back on all of this, what do you think the accomplishments really are? Well, the first thing we know for sure is they took enormous risks, and they definitely helped change the course of history. Number two, they were an immediate inspiration to the generations of suffragists who came after them, whose efforts resulted in the passage of the 20th Amendment, giving women the vote 55 years later in 1920. They also continue to be an inspiration to generations of women and to men to pursue their own goals, no matter what barriers there are. And finally, I can tell you this. Good intel knows no gender. Thank you for tuning in today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the program.
Thank you so much, Hilda. That was riveting and incredibly exciting as well. I especially have always loved the story of Elizabeth Van Lew, and I'm glad that we were finally able to highlight that. And well, really all of these stories, they're pretty incredible. Glad that we were able to highlight those here on this channel here. Like Hilda mentioned, we're going to have a resource list with some further reading. That link is going to be in the description of this video, so you can check on that. And if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave those in the comments of this video, or you can get in touch with us at the museum, and we'll pass those on to Hilda if you have any, anything you want to, converse with her further on, or any questions and such. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. Go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all the exciting stuff that we're producing. And if you want to support scholarship like this, consider becoming a member of the museum. And you can find links to become a member in the description of the video as well. So thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, this is John and Hilda signing off.